She can't manage her own life, Stepmom sobbed. I stayed calm. The judge exposed her hidden accounts and said, "You just stole $310,000 on court record." Her lawyer choked. She froze. No. Wait. She does not even know what day of the week it is, Your Honor. She is completely unraveling. She can barely manage to dress herself in the morning, let alone handle complex financial decisions. My stepmother, Monica, said those exact words without a single flutter of her eyelashes. She sat just 3 feet away from me in that freezing, cavernous courtroom, wearing a meticulously tailored black morning suit that probably cost more than my first car. The fabric was immaculate, perfectly pressed, presenting the image of a grieving, responsible matriarch. But what really caught my eye, what truly made my stomach turn, was my dead father's credit card wrapped casually around her wrist in the form of a heavy, solid gold Cartier watch. He bought her that specific watch 2 Christmases ago. Now, she was wearing his money while looking a county judge dead in the eye, trying with every ounce of her acting ability to convince him that I was mentally incompetent, entirely unstable, and needed to be legally locked away under her total control. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I did not even shift my weight in the uncomfortable, hard wooden chair at the defense table. I just folded my cold hands in my lap, stared blankly at the deep mahogany grain of the table in front of me, and counted silently in my head. 14. That was the exact number of days she had left. 14 days before her entire carefully constructed world collapsed into absolute ruin. That was the number of days before she lost everything she had ever stolen from my family, every dollar she had secretly siphoned away in the dark. Be completely honest with me for a second. Have you ever sat in a crowded room full of people who were supposed to be your family, people who were supposed to love and protect you, and watched every single one of them blindly believe a horrific, life-destroying lie about you? Because that cold morning in courtroom 4B of the Harris County Probate Court in Houston, Texas, I was entirely surrounded by people who shared my last name. My own aunt was sitting in the gallery right behind me, and not a single one of them was on my side. They were all captivated by Monica's performance. And it was the performance of a lifetime. She had a lace tissue crumpled perfectly in her manicured hand, delicately dabbing at the corners of her dry, tearless eyes. Her lawyer, a sleazy, overly confident man named Preston, whose gray suit jacket was at least 1 size too tight across his shoulders, was pacing dramatically in front of the bench. He was in the middle of an expansive, aggressive speech about my supposed cognitive decline, waving his hands around, demanding that the court immediately strip me of my human rights and hand total unchecked control of my father's massive estate over to Monica. He was practically vibrating with arrogance. He thought this was a guaranteed win. He looked at me like I was just a broken, confused 29-year-old girl who had completely lost her mind from the devastating grief of losing her father. But then, the steady, predictable rhythm of the courtroom suddenly broke. Judge Caldwell, a stern, silver-haired man in his early 60s who possessed a weathered face that looked like it had seen 1,000 desperate liars and was violently tired of every single one of them, suddenly stopped writing. If you know anything about the legal system, you know that is a universal tell. When a judge abruptly stops taking notes and lays his pen down flat on the desk, it means something just went terribly, irreversibly wrong for whoever is currently speaking. Judge Caldwell did not just put his pen down. He slowly picked up a thick, incredibly heavy, 200-page black binder from his desk. It was the exact binder I had quietly submitted into evidence just moments before. He slammed it down onto the elevated wooden bench so incredibly hard that the sound echoed off the high, vaulted ceiling like a gunshot. The entire courtroom physically jumped. Preston froze mid-sentence, his mouth hanging slightly open like a fish gasping for air on a dry dock. The judge slowly removed his reading glasses, leaned far over the bench, and looked directly, piercingly at Monica. His voice was low, remarkably calm, but it carried a terrifying weight that made the temperature in the room drop another 10 degrees. He looked right through her carefully constructed facade and demanded to know exactly how she planned to explain the $310,000 deliberately funneled into hidden offshore accounts. Preston went completely, horrifyingly pale. You could actually see the blood drain rapidly from his cheeks. Monica dropped her crumpled lace tissue onto the floor. Her perfectly rehearsed sad widow expression violently shattered into a look of pure, unadulterated terror. She completely froze, her breath catching in her throat. The entire gallery behind us went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. I just smiled inwardly, keeping my face perfectly neutral. To understand how we miraculously arrived at this beautiful, chaotic moment of ultimate justice and why my own flesh and blood thought I belonged in a psychiatric ward, I have to take you back in time. I have to show you the absolute monster my father married, and the 18 years of quiet poison she fed our family. Monica had been quietly slithering around the edges of my life since I was just 11 years old. She successfully married my father exactly 8 short months after my biological mother died of an incredibly aggressive form of pancreatic cancer. I remember the very first time I met her with crystal clarity. It was a Tuesday afternoon. She showed up at our front door with heavy, artificial blonde highlights, a freshly printed real estate license that she absolutely never intended to use, and a bright, manufactured, blinding smile that could charm the skin right off a venomous snake. She was incredibly loud. She wore way too much heavy floral perfume that lingered in the hallways for hours after she left, and she immediately started rearranging the antique furniture in our living room like she had lived there her entire life. She looked around our home not with love, but with the calculating eyes of an appraiser determining market value. My father, Donovan, God rest his gentle soul, was a genuinely good, hard-working man. He was soft-spoken, kind, and completely devoted to our family. But when my mother tragically died, his entire spirit completely broke. He was a man suddenly drowning in a deep, dark, suffocating ocean of grief, desperately thrashing around in the cold water for anything solid to hold on to. Monica threw him a lifeline, and, because he was rapidly suffocating under the weight of his own sadness, he eagerly grabbed it. He did not realize until it was way too late that the rope she threw him was actually a leash, designed to control his every movement. For 18 long, exhausting years, she meticulously managed him. And I do not mean she supported him as a loving wife should. I mean she managed him like he was a highly profitable corporate asset that needed to be aggressively protected from outside influence. The isolation started incredibly small, almost unnoticeable at first. First, she fired Maria. Maria was our sweet, elderly housekeeper who used to bake chocolate chip cookies with me on rainy afternoons and tell me funny stories about my mom's childhood. Monica abruptly claimed Maria was stealing expensive silverware. It was a complete, fabricated lie, of course, but my dad was simply too mentally exhausted to argue with her screaming fits. Maria was gone the next day, and with her, the last remaining warmth in our house vanished. Then she slowly and methodically started isolating him from his male friends. He used to have loud, messy, wonderful poker nights with his old college buddies every other Friday. Monica started constantly complaining about the noise. Then she complained about the cigar smoke ruining the drapes, and eventually, she would just stand in the kitchen glaring at them until the friends simply stopped coming around. Then she aggressively went after his family. My Aunt Margaret, my dad's fiercely loyal younger sister, used to come over every single Sunday for a big family dinner. Monica hated Margaret because Margaret could see right through the fake blonde hair and the Cartier watches. Monica started picking incredibly petty, vicious fights with her over nothing, making the atmosphere in the dining room so incredibly toxic and suffocatingly uncomfortable that Aunt Margaret eventually just stopped showing up for holidays altogether. Monica carefully made sure she was the absolute only voice my father heard. She isolated him from anyone who might have cared enough to pull him aside and tell him the harsh, undeniable truth. Monica did not love him. She never did. She loved his expansive stock portfolio. She deeply loved the massive, sweeping 4-bedroom colonial house in the highly exclusive River Oaks neighborhood. She loved the gorgeous lake house up in Conroe where she threw lavish, expensive parties for her snobby country club friends, while my dad stayed locked inside his study reading historical biographies. But most of all, above everything else, she loved the massive quarterly dividend checks from the commercial real estate trust that my grandfather had built from absolutely nothing back in the 1970s. Growing up as a teenager in that house was exactly like living in a silent, freezing Cold War. If my dad was physically present in the room, Monica would enthusiastically call me sweetheart, smile brightly, and gently smooth my hair down. The literal second he walked out of the room to take a phone call, her eyes would go completely dead, her smile would vanish, and she would treat me like I was a piece of annoying, ugly furniture she could not wait to throw out into the garbage. I quickly learned to keep my head down. I learned to be incredibly quiet, to walk lightly on the hardwood floors, and to never, ever ask for anything. I went away to a good college, got my accounting degree, and fiercely built my own independent life, just to stay completely out of her dangerous way. I mistakenly thought that as long as my dad was somewhat happy in his carefully crafted delusion, I could easily tolerate her toxic existence from a safe distance. But then, exactly 14 months ago, the delusion violently ended. My father suffered a massive, catastrophic stroke while sitting at his heavy oak desk in his home office. The man who had worked his entire life to quietly provide for us, the man who had let himself be manipulated just so he would not have to sleep in an empty bed, collapsed onto his expensive Persian rug, and absolutely everything changed forever. He died in the intensive care unit at Houston Methodist Hospital at exactly 6:47 on a miserable, freezing, rainy Tuesday morning. I will absolutely never forget the sterile, awful, terrifying smell of that hospital room. It smelled heavily of strong industrial bleach, copper, and the undeniable scent of impending loss. The only sound cutting through the heavy silence was the slow, agonizing, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor and the harsh, mechanical hiss of the ventilator machine physically forcing air into his failing lungs. I was sitting in a horribly uncomfortable, hard plastic chair pulled right up next to his bed, desperately holding his fragile hand. His skin felt exactly like thin, translucent paper. It was freezing cold, and the strong, capable fingers that used to lift me up onto his shoulders when I was a little girl were entirely limp and unresponsive. I was crying so incredibly hard that my chest physically ached, begging him in a whisper to just squeeze my hand one more time. Just one sign that he was still in there. He never did. But the part that still makes my blood boil with a rage I cannot fully describe, the part that I will absolutely never forgive as long as I have breath in my lungs, is what Monica was doing while my father was actively taking his final, painful breaths on this earth. She was not standing in the room holding his other hand. She was not weeping over his chest or whispering her goodbyes. I was completely exhausted and desperately needed a cup of terrible black hospital coffee just to stay awake, so I quietly stepped out into the bright, fluorescent-lit hallway. I immediately spotted Monica standing down by the elevator banks. She had her back to me, aggressively pacing back and forth, speaking frantically and loudly into her cell phone. I walked a little closer, my footsteps completely muffled by the cheap, thin hospital carpet, and I heard her voice clearly. She was not calling a priest to administer last rites. She was not calling Aunt Margaret to tell her to rush to the hospital. She was on the phone with my father's senior financial advisor. I heard her say the sickening words with absolute clarity. She aggressively asked the advisor how quickly they could quietly liquidate the mutual funds if his medical situation went completely south. She was actually asking about the specific tax penalties for early financial withdrawal before my father's heart had even stopped beating. I stood there completely frozen in the hallway, clutching a little paper cup of awful, burning hot coffee, feeling a rage so incredibly hot and violent that it almost blinded my vision. But I did not scream. I did not confront her. I just slowly turned around, walked quietly back into my father's dimly lit room, and closed the heavy wooden door behind me. I sat back down in the hard plastic chair, gently took his freezing hand in mine again, and less than an hour later, the slow, agonizing beeps on the heart monitor stretched out into one long, continuous, deafening, heart-shattering tone. The exact moment the rushing nurses flooded into the room to officially turn off the machines and record the time of death, Monica finally decided to make her grand, theatrical entrance. She burst through the heavy door, dramatically throwing her entire body weight onto the foot of the hospital bed, wailing and sobbing loudly enough for the entire ICU floor to hear her performance. She violently grabbed the bedsheets, screaming at the top of her lungs about how she absolutely could not live without him, how he was her one true soulmate, how her life was completely over. It was utterly sickening to watch. It was a perfectly choreographed, Oscar-worthy performance strictly for the benefit of the watching medical staff. I just stood silently in the dark corner of the room, my arms crossed over my chest, watching her brutally squeeze out fake, forced tears. I knew exactly what she was actually mourning. She was not crying for Donovan, the loving husband. She was desperately crying because her golden goose had just died, and she knew with absolute certainty that the financial clock on her luxury lifestyle was officially ticking down to zero. The funeral was an absolute, three-ring circus, entirely directed and produced by Monica. It rained the entire day, a cold, miserable Houston downpour that matched the mood perfectly. Monica wore a custom, designer black dress that fit a little too perfectly to have been bought off the rack at the last minute, paired with an oversized pair of dark designer sunglasses to hide her lack of actual tears. She spent the entire grueling afternoon at the muddy cemetery leaning heavily on my Aunt Margaret for physical support, flawlessly playing the role of the frail, devastated, heartbroken widow who could barely stand on her own 2 feet. Aunt Margaret, who had not spoken a single word to my father in over 3 years strictly because of Monica's toxic, isolating behavior, was completely and totally suckered in. Margaret kept gently patting Monica's back, crying genuine tears alongside her, whispering constantly that they needed to put the past behind them and stick together as a family now more than ever. Monica just nodded weakly, sniffled loudly into her lace handkerchief, and played the grieving crowd like a master conductor leading a symphony. I stood silently on the opposite side of the grave in a simple, understated black dress, watching wet clumps of dirt hit the polished mahogany wood of my father's casket, feeling entirely, utterly alone in a crowd of over 50 people. But the real, earth-shattering shock did not hit me until exactly 1 week after we buried him. Monica had gone out to an incredibly expensive, exclusive luxury day spa to, in her own ridiculous words, decompress from the overwhelming trauma. I took the rare opportunity of her absence to drive my car over to the massive River Oaks house. I genuinely just wanted to look for some old family photo albums from when my mom was still alive, things I wanted to keep before Monica inevitably threw them away. I walked slowly into my dad's home office. The room still smelled heavily of his rich cedar cologne, old paper, and leather-bound books. It felt like a museum dedicated to a ghost. I sat down at his heavy oak desk, just gently tracing my fingers over the polished wood, missing him so much it physically hurt to breathe. I opened the bottom, heavy wooden drawer to look for a specific silver picture frame I remembered he kept there. But instead of the frame, I found a heavy, thick manila envelope shoved aggressively all the way to the very back, completely hidden underneath a large stack of old, useless appliance warranty manuals. It looked incredibly out of place. It was a formal legal document. I pulled it out and realized it was my father's last will and testament, and it boldly carried a bright blue notary stamp showing it was officially updated and legally finalized exactly 18 months before he died. I carefully opened the flap and began to read through the heavy, dense legal jargon. The first page was exactly what I expected. My father had left the massive house in River Oaks, all of its expensive contents, and the beautiful lake house in Conroe entirely to Monica. That was standard. But then I nervously flipped to the second page. The Commercial Real Estate Trust. The massive, incredibly lucrative trust that my grandfather had built from nothing, which currently held roughly $4.2 million in prime commercial property and liquid investment accounts. He left it entirely, unconditionally to me. 100% of the assets. Furthermore, he had explicitly written a clause completely removing Monica from having any legal authority or control over the trust whatsoever. I sat there in the quiet office, completely stunned. He had known. On some deep, unspoken level, my dad had known exactly who the woman sleeping next to him truly was, and he had quietly, bravely taken the necessary legal steps to completely protect his family's financial legacy before his failing health betrayed him. But there was a second, far more terrifying discovery waiting for me. As I held the envelope closer to my face, my blood ran completely cold. The manila envelope did not smell like old paper, dust, or cedar cologne. It smelled overwhelmingly strong of heavy, expensive floral perfume. Monica's signature perfume. I looked much closer at the top flap of the envelope. It had clearly been ripped open previously and then hastily, sloppily resealed with a cheap glue stick. The realization hit me like a physical punch to the gut. Monica already knew. She had gone through his private desk while he was away at a lengthy cardiology appointment months ago and found the updated draft. She had known for exactly 4 agonizing months that she was about to be completely cut out of the big money. Knowing with absolute certainty that Monica had secretly discovered the updated will completely change the entire landscape of reality. It meant she had a massive, 4-month head start on whatever twisted, greedy plan she was currently cooking up in that calculating brain of hers. I did not waste a single second. I immediately pulled out my laptop, connected to my dad's incredibly fast home Wi-Fi, and navigated to the highly secure online banking portal for the family trust. I had always possessed view-only access to these accounts since I turned 18, though I rarely ever checked the balances while my dad was alive because I fully trusted him to manage the investments. My hands were actually shaking with adrenaline as I rapidly typed in my complex password and hit enter. I immediately clicked on the primary operating account ledger. This was the massive liquid cash account used dynamically to pay large commercial property taxes, fund expensive maintenance fees, and distribute the hefty quarterly dividends. Usually, it held a very steady, very high 6-figure balance to ensure liquidity. I held my breath and started aggressively scrolling backward through the transaction history, going straight back to the exact week Monica would have frantically found the updated will hidden in the desk drawer. And right there on the glowing screen I saw it. The financial bleeding. It was not one massive, obvious, reckless transfer. Monica was incredibly greedy, but she was definitely not stupid enough to wire out $500,000 at once. She knew that would have instantly triggered a mandatory, automatic fraud audit from the bank and immediately alerted my father via a phone call. No, she was quietly siphoning the money out exactly like a blood-sucking parasite. I saw a discreet wire transfer for $5,000. 2 days later, a quiet ACH transfer for $8,000. A week after that, a withdrawal for $6,500. Every single one of them was carefully labeled with incredibly vague, boring, corporate-sounding descriptions like property management consulting, HVAC maintenance retainer, or quarterly legal assessment. I frantically grabbed a yellow legal pad and a blue ink pen from my dad's desk and started writing down every single outgoing number that looked remotely suspicious. I sat completely alone in my dad's quiet, dark office for 3 solid hours, obsessively tracking the slow, incredibly methodical drain of the trust's financial lifeblood. She was actively funding a secret luxury lifestyle, fully aware that her time was about to abruptly end, aggressively stashing massive amounts of untraceable cash away in places she assumed my dad would not immediately notice before he died. By the time I finally reached the exact date of my father's death on the ledger, my hand was cramping. I slowly added up the massive column of numbers in my notebook using my phone's calculator. The final total was exactly $310,000. She had quietly, efficiently moved over $300,000 into external accounts I could not currently see, effectively stealing a massive fortune right out from under a dying man's nose while smiling at him over the dinner table. Now, I want you to truly think about what most normal people would do in this exact, infuriating situation. Most people would completely lose their absolute minds. Most people would grab that yellow notebook, drive furiously straight to the luxury day spa, scream aggressively at their stepmother in front of a lobby full of wealthy strangers, hire the most aggressive bulldog lawyer in Houston, file a massive, highly publicized lawsuit, and probably post the entire dramatic, weeping saga on social media for sympathy. Most people would react with explosive, uncontrollable, righteous anger. And that is precisely what Monica was aggressively counting on. As I sat there staring blankly at those devastating numbers, a chilling realization washed over me. Monica did not just steal the money. She had a highly calculated secondary plan. She knew that if I reacted emotionally, if I made wild, screaming accusations about stolen money without hard proof of destination, if I came completely unglued in front of Aunt Margaret and the rest of the grieving family, she would just calmly point to my chaotic, screaming behavior and say, "Look at Valerie. Look how crazy she is. She is entirely unstable. She is paranoid and grieving and hallucinating. She is entirely unfit to manage a $4 million fortune." She desperately needed me to look completely crazy to the outside world. That was phase 2 of her theft. First, you take the money in the dark. Then, you take the victim's credibility in the light. Because without absolute credibility, nobody believes you when you finally scream that the money is gone. It is a highly effective, incredibly destructive move pulled straight out of the master narcissist playbook. They do not just hurt you, they meticulously set the stage so that when you try to tell someone what they did, you sound totally, undeniably insane. So, I made a choice. I didn't scream. I didn't hire a lawyer. I didn't even call the police. Instead, I did the exact opposite of what she aggressively wanted me to do. I decided to completely disappear into the background. I initiated what I quietly called my own personal ghost protocol. The very first thing I did was put the will exactly back where I found it in the drawer, meticulously making sure the envelope looked entirely untouched. Then I drove back to my own apartment. It was a really nice, spacious one-bedroom place in a highly desirable part of town, an apartment that my father had been generously helping me pay for since I graduated college. I knew that living in that nice building made me look comfortable, highly capable, and financially stable. That image had to change immediately if my trap was going to work. I aggressively broke my apartment lease the very next morning, perfectly willing to lose my hefty security deposit. I did not hire movers. I frantically packed all my nice corporate clothes, my expensive shoes, and anything of significant value into cheap, black plastic garbage bags. I completely bypassed cardboard boxes because I wanted the entire moving process to look unhinged, chaotic, and desperate. I scoured the internet and found a tiny, incredibly run-down, depressing studio apartment in the Montrose area that cost exactly $800 a month. The dilapidated building smelled perpetually of old boiled cabbage and cheap cigarettes. The rusty faucet in the microscopic kitchen leaked a constant, maddening drip that echoed at night, and the cheap drywall was so incredibly paper-thin I could hear my neighbor coughing and snoring. It was utterly miserable, but it was absolutely perfect for the false narrative I was about to carefully construct. I deliberately stopped getting my hair cut or colored. I completely stopped wearing any makeup, allowing the natural exhaustion of my grief to clearly show on my face. I stopped driving the newer, reliable sedan I usually drove and instead started driving my old, rattling, 10-year-old Honda Civic everywhere, intentionally leaving my good car parked indefinitely at a close friend's house. I wanted to look exactly like the broken, helpless, rapidly declining 29-year-old girl that Monica was currently whispering to everyone that I was. I told absolutely no one what I had found in the financial ledger. Not my closest friends, not my concerned coworkers, and definitely, absolutely not anyone in my extended family. The crushing weight of the isolation was brutal. There were long, freezing nights where I sat alone on the cheap linoleum floor of that terrible studio apartment, listening to the leaky faucet drip, eating completely tasteless cheap ramen noodles out of a styrofoam cup, and I just wanted to pick up the phone, call Aunt Margaret, and beg her for help. I wanted to cry on her shoulder and tell her everything, but I forced myself to put the phone down. I knew with absolute certainty that if I showed a single, solitary card, if I gave Monica even a hint that I was onto her, she would immediately change her strategy, cover her digital tracks, and I would lose the money forever. I was actively sacrificing my own physical comfort, my own mental peace, and my own family reputation to patiently build an inescapable trap. I was going to let her keep stealing. I was going to let her feel so incredibly safe, so totally, arrogantly dominant, that she would eventually make a legal mistake so massive she would never, ever be able to walk away from it. She genuinely thought she was casually playing checkers against a broken, grieving child. She had absolutely no idea who she was actually sitting across the chessboard from. Thank you for watching so far. If you are enjoying this story, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling me which city you are watching from. Every single comment helps push this video to more people, and I really appreciate your support. Now, let's get back to the trap. Thanksgiving aggressively arrived about a month after I moved into the depressing Montrose studio. It was the very first major family holiday without my dad, and Aunt Margaret had eagerly insisted on hosting it at her beautiful suburban house to keep the family united. I pulled up to her manicured driveway in my rattling, embarrassing Civic, deliberately wearing a faded, oversized beige sweater and baggy jeans that were a little too loose because I had legitimately lost a few pounds from the stress. I had not slept well in over 5 days, so the deep, dark purple circles completely shadowing my eyes were entirely genuine. When I slowly walked through the heavy front oak door, the warm house smelled incredibly inviting, a rich mix of roasted turkey, fresh sage, and cinnamon, creating a sharp, painful contrast to the depressing smell of old cabbage in my terrible apartment. Monica was naturally already there, confidently holding a large glass of expensive white wine and holding court in the center of the living room. When she saw me walk in looking like an absolute wreck, her eyes briefly lit up with a flash of predatory, vicious glee, though she immediately, expertly masked it with a heavy look of deep, dramatic, motherly concern. She rushed aggressively across the room, pulling me into a highly suffocating, forced hug that smelled overwhelmingly of her heavy floral perfume. "Valerie, sweetheart," she cooed incredibly loudly, carefully making sure every single family member in the room paused to watch our interaction. "Oh my God, look at you. You look so unbelievably tired. Are you even eating? Are you taking care of yourself in that new place?" I forced myself to keep my shoulders heavily slumped and my gaze aimed directly at the floorboards. I mumbled a quiet, pathetic, "I'm fine, Monica," and desperately tried to pull away. During the actual sit-down dinner, she dialed the psychological, covert torture up to an absolute 11. She kept loudly passing me plates of food like I was a helpless toddler who could not physically feed herself. Halfway through the incredibly tense meal, while Aunt Margaret was quietly pouring gravy for her husband, Monica reached entirely across the large dining table, placed her perfectly manicured, heavy hand completely over mine, and sighed with massive, theatrical sadness. "Valerie," she said, her voice dripping with thick, fake sympathy that made my skin crawl. "I have been so incredibly worried about you ever since you suddenly moved into that awful, dangerous little neighborhood. Your poor father would be absolutely heartbroken to see his only daughter living like this. Have you been remembering to take your medication?" The entire busy dining table went instantly, horrifyingly dead silent. The clinking of silverware completely stopped. Aunt Margaret literally froze while pouring the gravy. I did not have any medication. I was not legally prescribed anything stronger than over-the-counter ibuprofen. But Monica dropped the heavy question so incredibly casually, so naturally, that it immediately, successfully planted the toxic seed in everyone's mind that I was secretly undergoing severe psychiatric treatment for a massive mental breakdown. I felt a sudden, boiling hot flush of pure anger crawl violently up my neck. I wanted to stand up and flip the heavy dining table entirely over. I wanted to scream at the top of my lungs that she was a filthy, lying thief. But I instantly remembered the $310,000. I remembered the meticulously planned trap. So, I played my humiliating part perfectly. I yanked my shaking hand away from hers like I had been physically burned, widened my eyes to look slightly paranoid and panicked, and stuttered loudly, I don't know what you're talking about. Just leave me alone. I stood up so abruptly that my heavy wooden chair knocked backward onto the floor, and I practically ran down the hallway to the guest bathroom. I locked the door, gripped the cold edges of the porcelain sink until my knuckles turned bright white, and stared intensely at my own pale, exhausted reflection. I was physically shaking with suppressed rage. Letting my own aunt, the wonderful woman who used to eagerly bake me birthday cakes, look at me with absolute fear and deep pity was easily the hardest, most humiliating thing I had ever done in my entire life. It felt exactly like I was intentionally betraying my own dignity. When I finally composed myself and walked back out, Aunt Margaret was looking directly at Monica with a shared, solemn, heartbreaking understanding. The false narrative was now permanently set in stone. Valerie was completely losing her mind. I left the agonizing dinner early. I got into my freezing, rattling car, gripped the steering wheel, and finally let myself openly cry. I cried for my dad, I cried for the absolute, humiliating mess my daily life had become, and I cried because the evil gaslighting was working absolutely perfectly. But by the time I finally pulled into the dark parking lot of my terrible apartment complex, the tears had completely stopped. The overwhelming sadness burned completely off, leaving behind a cold, sharp, dangerous, hyper-focused anger. I aggressively wiped my face, walked determinedly up the stairs to my room, and unlocked the door. Monica genuinely thought I was just a low-level, mid-tier accounting clerk working at some boring, nameless financial firm. A weak girl with a boring job and a completely boring life. What she absolutely did not know, what literally nobody in my entire family truly understood about my actual career, was that I had spent the last 6 grueling years working as a highly specialized forensic auditor for a private firm that directly contracted with the IRS. My entire professional career, my highly specific area of absolute expertise, was aggressively tracking stolen, hidden money through incredibly dark, complex digital hallways, untangling massive webs of corporate fraud, and building airtight, inescapable federal cases against ruthless people who were significantly smarter than Monica. She arrogantly thought she was easily stealing from a broken, grieving, helpless daughter. She did not realize she had just proudly declared total war on a woman who hunted dangerous financial predators for a living. I turned on my laptop, cracked my knuckles, and started the real hunt. The very next morning, I transformed my miserable, $800 studio apartment into a fully functional forensic command center. I went to a cheap electronics recycling store and bought 2 extra computer monitors, setting them up on a flimsy, plastic folding table I pushed against the peeling wallpaper of my living room. I brewed a massive pot of terrible, cheap black coffee, tied my hair up into a messy bun, and officially went to work. Monica completely underestimated me because she only saw what she wanted to see, a weak, grieving girl. She did not know that at my actual job, I regularly untangled massive webs of corporate fraud. I used specialized tracing software, secure virtual private networks, and a deep, encyclopedic knowledge of banking regulations to hunt people for a living. I took a deep breath, cracked my knuckles, and started following the digital breadcrumbs she had so carelessly left behind. I started with the wire transfers from the family trust account. Each transfer was accompanied by a unique digital fingerprint, an IP address that logged exactly where the request originated. It took me less than 3 hours to cross-reference those IP logs with public internet service provider data. Every single one of the 47 unauthorized transfers originated from the exact same device, a Dell laptop actively registered to the home network at my father's River Oaks address. Specifically, Monica's personal laptop. But tracing the origin was only the very first step. I needed to know exactly where the money was resting. I dug into the 3 corporate entities that were receiving the funds. They were named Bluebird Properties, Gulf Horizon Consulting, and Legacy Asset Management. The sheer arrogance of naming her theft vehicle Legacy almost made me laugh out loud. I ran their corporate registrations and found that all 3 were shell companies incorporated in the state of Wyoming. Wyoming is notoriously friendly to corporate secrecy, allowing people to hide their identities behind registered agent services. However, they teach you in forensic accounting that criminals always get lazy when they think nobody is watching. I pulled the initial incorporation documents filed with the Wyoming Secretary of State. While the public-facing documents listed a generic nominee director, Monica had paid the filing fees using a credit card that was directly linked to a secondary bank account. I aggressively tracked the routing numbers of that specific account. The money flowed into the Wyoming shell companies, sat completely stagnant for 30 to 60 days to avoid triggering money laundering algorithms, and then it was quietly transferred again. It all funneled down into a single, massive personal brokerage account held at Charles Schwab. I leaned forward, my face inches from the glowing monitors. I pulled the ownership records for the Charles Schwab brokerage account. It was not a solo account. It was a joint account, held by two people. The primary account holder was Monica. The secondary account holder was a man named Lance. I stared at the name Lance on my screen, my heart pounding heavily in my chest. I immediately ran a comprehensive background check on him. Lance was a mid-level, relatively unsuccessful commercial real estate agent based 50 miles south in Galveston, Texas. He was exactly Monica's type, heavily tanned, overly groomed, and desperate for the kind of serious money he could never make on his own. I did not stop there. I pulled up public property records for Galveston County, cross-referencing Lance's name. A massive red flag instantly popped up. Exactly 2 months after my father's catastrophic stroke, while my dad was completely incapacitated in a hospital bed fighting for his life, Lance and Monica had co-signed a lease agreement for a stunning, multi-million-dollar beachfront luxury condo in Galveston. I sat back in my cheap folding chair, rubbing my tired eyes as the sun started to rise outside my small window. The picture was completely, horrifyingly clear. Monica had not just stolen the money to maintain her own lifestyle. She was actively building an entirely new life, funding a secret romantic relationship, and buying beachfront real estate using the blood money she was systematically draining from my dying father's legacy. She had been sleeping with Lance while playing the devoted, weeping wife. The anger I felt was no longer hot and chaotic. It was ice-cold, sharp, and entirely focused. Finding the digital proof was incredibly satisfying, but it was not enough for a courtroom. I needed physical, undeniable proof of their relationship. I needed to catch them together. That Friday night, I waited until well past midnight. I put on a dark hoodie, grabbed a high-powered digital camera with a telephoto lens I had borrowed from a private investigator friend at work, and walked down to my rattling Honda Civic. I merged onto Interstate 45 South, driving the 50 miles from Houston down to the dark, windy coast of Galveston. The drive felt incredibly long. The highway was completely empty, and the only sound was the rattling of my old engine and the hum of the tires on the asphalt. I kept thinking about my dad. I thought about how he used to take me to Galveston when I was a little girl, buying me ice cream on the seawall and pointing out the massive cargo ships in the distance. He loved the ocean. It made me physically sick to my stomach to know that Monica was using his hard-earned money to play house on that very same beach with another man. I pulled into the affluent beachfront neighborhood around 2 in the morning. The salty ocean air hit my face as I parked my car 2 blocks away from the luxury condo building I had found in the public property records. I walked quietly down the pristine sidewalk, hiding in the heavy shadows of the large palm trees. The building was a massive, modern structure made of glass and white concrete, overlooking the crashing waves of the Gulf of Mexico. I checked the unit number from the lease agreement I had pulled. Unit 402. 4th floor, corner balcony. I found a dark spot on the public beach directly across from the building, sat down in the cold, damp sand, and pulled out my camera. I rested the heavy lens on my knees to keep it perfectly steady and zoomed in on the 4th floor balcony. The lights inside the unit were still glowing a warm, soft yellow. I sat there shivering in the cold coastal wind for almost 2 hours. My legs were completely numb, and my fingers were stiff, but I refused to move. I was a ghost. I was a hunter waiting for the prey to step into the clearing. Finally, right around 4 in the morning, the sliding glass door of the balcony opened. My heart hammered against my ribs. I pressed my eye to the viewfinder and rapidly adjusted the focus ring. Through the powerful lens, the image was incredibly crisp. It was Monica. She was wearing a highly expensive, pure silk robe, holding 2 crystal wine glasses. A moment later, Lance walked out onto the balcony behind her. He was exactly what his background check photo suggested: slicked back hair, an overly tanned face, and the arrogant posture of a man who thought he was completely untouchable. I held my breath and pressed the shutter button. The camera fired rapidly, silently capturing frame after frame in high resolution. Through the lens, I watched Lance wrap his arms intimately around Monica's waist from behind. She leaned her head back against his shoulder, laughing at something he whispered in her ear. They stood there drinking expensive wine, looking out over the dark ocean, looking like a perfectly happy, wealthy couple. I kept my finger pressed firmly on the shutter button, documenting every single touch, every smile, every undeniable piece of physical evidence that completely destroyed the false narrative she was feeding my family. They were entirely relaxed. They had absolutely no idea that less than 300 yards away, the grieving, pathetic, supposedly insane stepdaughter they were robbing blind was meticulously sealing their fate into a digital memory card. I lowered the camera when they finally walked back inside and closed the heavy glass doors. I sat alone in the dark on the freezing sand, listening to the waves crash against the shore. I had the financial records. I had the IP addresses. I had the corporate filings. And now I had the undeniable photographic proof of the affair and the beachfront condo. I packed the camera safely into my backpack, stood up on my stiff legs, and walked back to my car. As I drove back up the dark highway toward Houston, a deep, powerful sense of calm washed over me. The investigation phase was officially complete. I had successfully gathered all the weapons I needed. Now I just had to wait for Monica to make her move. I knew she was getting impatient, and impatient criminals always make fatal, arrogant mistakes. The fatal mistake happened exactly 3 weeks later on a miserable, rainy Tuesday evening. I was sitting on the floor of my studio apartment, eating a bowl of cold cereal, wearing a massive, stained oversized t-shirt and loose sweatpants. My hair was tangled, and I looked like an absolute disaster, which was exactly how I intended to look. Suddenly, there was a loud, aggressive knock at my thin wooden door. I did not have any friends coming over, and the delivery driver usually just left packages in the lobby. I walked cautiously over to the door and looked through the small, scratched peephole. It was Aunt Margaret. She was standing in the dim hallway, clutching her purse tightly, looking incredibly anxious and deeply sad. But she was not alone. Standing slightly behind her, looking perfectly composed in a sharp beige trench coat, was Monica. My stomach dropped. This was an ambush. I quickly unlocked the deadbolt and cracked the door open just a few inches, keeping the security chain attached. "Aunt Margaret?" I asked, making sure my voice sounded shaky and confused. "What are you doing here?" "Valerie, sweetheart, please let us in," Margaret said gently, her voice thick with unshed tears. "We need to talk to you. We are all just so worried about you." I hesitated, intentionally acting incredibly paranoid. "I didn't invite you here. I'm busy. Please go away." Monica stepped forward, putting on her most sickeningly sweet, motherly voice. "Valerie, please. Look at this place. Look at yourself. You are clearly not well. We just want to help you get the medical care you so desperately need." I knew exactly what this was. This was a forced, entirely staged family intervention. Monica had manipulated my aunt into ambushing me so that Monica could manufacture more evidence of my supposed mental decline. I knew I had to play the part perfectly, even if it meant breaking my aunt's heart a little bit more. I unhooked the chain and swung the door open. I did not invite them to sit down. I just stood in the middle of my small, messy living room, crossing my arms defensively over my chest. "I don't need your help," I said loudly, pacing nervously back and forth. I intentionally kept my eyes darting around the room, avoiding eye contact. "I am perfectly fine. You are all just suffocating me. You won't leave me alone." "Valerie, you are completely spiraling," Monica said calmly, stepping fully into the room. I noticed something very specific. She was holding her expensive leather purse at an incredibly awkward angle, the top slightly unzipped, facing directly toward me. She was secretly recording the conversation on her phone. The absolute audacity of this woman made me want to scream, but I instantly adapted. If she wanted a recording of an unhinged, paranoid girl, I was going to give her an Oscar-winning vocal performance. "Get out!" I shouted suddenly, raising my voice to a shrill, panicked pitch. I pointed a trembling finger directly at the door. "You are trying to control me. You always hated me, Monica. You just want me out of the way. Get out of my apartment before I call the police." Aunt Margaret actually recoiled, tears finally spilling over her cheeks. She looked at me with pure terror, fully believing that her niece had suffered a complete psychotic break. "Valerie, please calm down," she begged, reaching out a hand. "I said get out," I screamed, grabbing the edge of the wooden door and holding it wide open. Monica placed a comforting, fake hand on Margaret's trembling shoulder. "It's okay, Margaret. We tried. She is clearly too far gone to listen to reason right now. We have to take the next steps." They walked out into the hallway. Monica turned back to look at me one last time before I slammed the door. She did not look sad. She looked incredibly smug. She had exactly what she came for, a highly volatile, screaming audio recording of my supposed paranoia, witnessed firsthand by my own flesh and blood. I slammed the door shut, locked the deadbolt, and leaned heavily against the wood. My heart was racing. I slid down to the floor, buried my face in my hands, and took a long, shaky breath. Acting like a lunatic in front of my grieving aunt was utterly exhausting and humiliating. But I knew that audio recording was the final piece Monica needed to launch her legal attack. The trap was finally set, and the prey had just proudly taken the bait. The heavy legal attack arrived exactly 4 days later, delivered by a bored-looking process server who knocked on my door at 8 in the morning. He handed me a thick, heavy manila envelope stamped with the official seal of the Harris County Probate Court. I sat down at my cheap kitchen table, poured myself a cup of coffee, and methodically opened the envelope. It was a formal petition for an emergency conservatorship. Monica was officially asking a judge to strip me of all my legal rights, freeze my access to all financial accounts, and appoint her as my permanent legal guardian and the sole executor of the family trust. I read through the wild accusations. The petition claimed I was a danger to myself, completely incapable of managing my own basic daily needs, and suffering from severe, untreated mental illness. It claimed I had aggressively threatened my family members, referencing the exact date of the staged intervention. But the most critical piece of the petition was attached at the very back of the packet. It was a formal medical evaluation, printed on incredibly expensive, embossed stationery. I pulled it out and read it carefully. The report was signed by a man named Dr. Alden. The clinical diagnosis was terrifyingly thorough. It stated that I was suffering from severe dissociative disorder, paranoid delusions, and rapid cognitive decline. It recommended immediate, mandatory psychiatric hospitalization and fully endorsed Monica taking total control of my finances for my own safety. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. Something was glaringly, legally wrong. I had never, ever in my entire life met Dr. Alden. I had never stepped foot inside his office. I had never spoken to him on the phone. He had written a highly detailed, legally binding clinical diagnosis of a woman he had never even seen in person, basing his entire professional medical opinion strictly on the word of my stepmother and the completely out-of-context audio recording she had illegally captured in my apartment. Over the phone. He diagnosed me over the phone. I immediately opened my laptop and started digging into Dr. Alden. It took me less than 40 minutes of navigating through social media connections, country club newsletters, and public charity event photos to find exactly what I was looking for. Dr. Alden was not just a random, easily manipulated psychiatrist. He was a longtime member of the highly exclusive Galveston Country Club. And sitting right next to him in a brightly lit, smiling photograph taken at a charity golf tournament just 3 months ago, holding a golf club and wearing a ridiculous visor, was Lance. The circle was completely closed. The doctor who provided the fraudulent medical report was Lance's close, personal golf buddy. Monica had used her secret lover to secure a dirty doctor willing to sign a fake medical document to help her steal millions of dollars. This was no longer just a civil dispute over a family trust. This was an active, highly organized criminal conspiracy. They were committing medical fraud, aggravated perjury, and massive financial theft, all bundled neatly into one arrogant, incredibly stupid court filing. I carefully printed out the country club photograph of Dr. Alden and Lance laughing together on the golf course. I slid it into a clear plastic sheet protector. This was going to be the absolute final nail in their collective coffin. They thought they had built an airtight legal cage around me. They thought bringing a doctor into the mix would make their case completely bulletproof before a judge. But they had absolutely no idea that in their arrogant rush to steal my father's legacy, they had just handed a professional forensic auditor a fully documented, easily provable trail of multiple federal felonies. I looked at the date on the court summons. The emergency hearing was scheduled for exactly 7 days from now. I had 1 week left to prepare the ultimate execution. I smiled, a genuine, cold smile, and reached for the stack of empty binders I had bought earlier that week. It was time to put the weapon together. I spent the entire week before the massive court hearing meticulously building the weapon that was going to completely destroy Monica's life. I went to a local office supply store and bought the thickest, heaviest black binder they sold on the shelf. It was designed to hold over 200 pages of documents. I also bought a huge pack of brightly colored plastic tabs, a high-quality 3-hole punch, and several expensive ink cartridges for my small printer. I cleared absolutely everything off my cheap folding table and began the slow, incredibly deliberate process of assembling the evidence. I treated the binder exactly like I treated the files I prepared for federal prosecutors at work. Every single page had to be perfect, undeniable, and entirely self-explanatory. I created distinct, color-coded sections. The red tabs were exclusively for the financial records. I printed out all 47 wire transfer confirmations from the family trust account, highlighting the exact dates and the stolen amounts. I included the comprehensive Charles Schwab joint account statements showing the money flowing directly to Monica and Lance. The blue tabs were for the digital forensics. This section contained the complex IP logs proving the transfers originated from Monica's personal Dell laptop at the River Oaks house. It completely destroyed any potential argument that a random hacker had stolen the money. The green tabs were for the corporate filings. I included the official Wyoming Secretary of State documents, the hidden credit card receipts showing Monica paid the registration fees for the 3 shell companies, and the property lease for the luxury Galveston condo co-signed by Lance. Finally, the yellow tabs were for the perjury and the conspiracy. This section contained the high-resolution photographs I had taken on the freezing beach in Galveston, showing Monica and Lance intimately embracing. Right behind those photos, I placed the country club picture of Dr. Alden playing golf with Lance, completely invalidating the fraudulent medical report attached to the conservatorship petition. By the time I was finally finished, the black binder was incredibly heavy. It felt like a massive brick of pure, undeniable justice. The psychological and physical toll of the last 5 months suddenly hit me all at once. My apartment was a complete disaster. I was surviving on coffee and adrenaline, and I was deeply, profoundly exhausted from constantly lying to my own aunt. I sat on my lumpy mattress, staring at the completed black binder resting on the table, and I felt incredibly lonely. The day before the trial, I put on a warm coat and drove my old car out to the quiet, peaceful cemetery on the south side of Houston. It was a cold, overcast afternoon. I walked slowly across the damp grass until I reached my father's grave, located right next to my mother's under a massive, ancient live oak tree that dropped heavy acorns every fall. I sat down on the cold, wet grass, pulled my knees to my chest, and finally spoke out loud. "I know what she did, Dad," I whispered, my voice cracking slightly in the empty cemetery. "I know everything. I know why you changed the will, and I know how much she took from us. But I promise you, she is not going to get away with it. I am going to protect what you built." I am going to protect Mom's legacy. I sat there for almost an hour in the quiet cold, just talking to them in my head, telling them how absolutely terrified I had been every single night. I confessed that I wasn't naturally brave, that I woke up constantly at 3 in the morning with my heart violently racing, terrified that I was making a massive mistake and that the judge would actually believe Monica. But sitting there under the oak tree, I realized that true strength is not the magical absence of fear. True strength is feeling completely terrified, knowing the person across the table is lying to your face, and choosing to patiently sit there and build your case anyway. I stood up, gently brushed the wet grass off my jeans, and touched the cold stone of my father's marker one last time. I was no longer the weak, grieving daughter Monica thought I was. I was entirely ready for war. Which brings us directly back to that freezing Wednesday morning in courtroom 4B. The heavy, dramatic silence in the room was absolutely suffocating. Monica's sleazy lawyer, Preston, was still standing frozen in the middle of the aisle, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to form words, but his brain had completely short-circuited. Judge Caldwell had just slammed my heavy, 200-page black binder onto his elevated wooden desk, completely interrupting Preston's arrogant speech about my supposed mental incompetence. The judge stared down at Monica with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust, demanding an explanation for the $310,000 hidden in offshore accounts. Everyone in the packed gallery, including Aunt Margaret, held their collective breath. They had all come to this courtroom fully expecting to watch a tragic breakdown. They wanted to see tears. They wanted to see the helpless, confused, insane little girl that Monica had been so vividly describing for months. Instead, I decided it was my turn to finally speak. I stood up from the defense table incredibly slowly. I did not rush. I took my time, deliberately buttoning the center button of my cheap blazer. I completely ignored the judge for a moment. I completely ignored Preston. I turned my body and looked directly, intensely at Monica. I held her panicked, terrified gaze for 3 full, unblinking seconds. In the field of behavioral psychology, that specific action is known as a dominance display. It is exactly what you do when you want a predator to know deep in their bones that you are absolutely not afraid of them anymore and that the power dynamic has permanently shifted. I watched the muscles in Monica's jaw twitch violently. She felt the ground entirely drop out from under her feet, even if she didn't fully comprehend the magnitude of the trap yet. Then I slowly turned my attention to the bench. "I am listening, Your Honor," I said, my voice ringing out clearly and calmly across the silent room. I just wanted to make absolutely sure my stepmother was completely finished with her opening remarks. I certainly would not want to interrupt her while she is still speaking under oath. Preston finally snapped out of his shock and scrambled back to his table. "Your Honor, I strongly object," he practically shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "We have not been provided any of this so-called evidence in discovery. This is a complete ambush. My client is making serious medical allegations about the respondent's mental capacity." "Sit down, Mr. Preston," Judge Caldwell snapped, his voice sharp like a cracking whip. He did not even look at the lawyer. He was already busy flipping through the brightly colored tabs of my binder. "The respondent submitted this documentation directly to the clerk 30 minutes before this hearing began. Considering your client is actively petitioning to strip this young woman of her basic civil rights and seize millions of dollars in assets, I am going to allow it." The judge paused, flipping to the first red tab. His eyes scanned the page rapidly, absorbing the data. "I did not just lose track of my mind, Your Honor, and I certainly did not lose track of $310,000, I stated loudly, making sure Aunt Margaret heard every single syllable. "I actively watched every single dollar leave the family trust. I know exactly where it went, I know exactly when it went, and I know exactly who she sent it to." Monica gripped the heavy wooden edge of her table so incredibly hard that her knuckles turned stark white. "She is lying," Monica suddenly blurted out, breaking her fragile character for the very first time. Her voice was shrill, desperate. "She is delusional. She fabricated all of those papers. This is exactly what I've been trying to tell you. She is completely paranoid and makes things up." Judge Caldwell raised his hand, instantly demanding silence. He looked at Monica with an expression I will treasure for the rest of my life. It was not just anger. It was the deeply offended look of a powerful man who had just realized he was being used as a pawn in a cheap criminal scheme. He turned his gaze back to me, nodding slightly. Please continue, Miss Valerie. Walk this court through the blue tabs. I did not need to look at my notes. I had memorized every single page of that black binder during those long, lonely nights in my miserable apartment. The blue tabs contain the certified IP logs from every single unauthorized wire transfer, Your Honor, I explained, my voice steady and echoing clearly in the silent courtroom. Over the past 11 months, exactly 47 individual transfers were made from the trust's operating account. Every single one of those transfers originated from the exact same digital device, a Dell Inspiron laptop officially registered to the private home network at my father's River Oaks address. That is my stepmother's primary residence. Preston jumped up again, sweating profusely. Your Honor, IP addresses can be easily spoofed or hacked. This proves absolutely nothing about my client's involvement. Which brings us to the green tabs, Your Honor, I continued smoothly, completely ignoring Preston's desperate outburst. You will see the bank statements for 3 corporate entities, Bluebird Properties, Gulf Horizon Consulting, and Legacy Asset Management. All 3 are shell companies incorporated in Wyoming, using a registered agent service to hide the beneficial owner. I paused and turned slightly to look directly at Monica. She looked like she was going to be physically sick. However, I said loudly, the incorporation documents clearly list the credit card used to pay the state filing fees. That credit card belongs directly to Monica. Furthermore, the money flows from those 3 shell companies into a personal, joint brokerage account at Charles Schwab. That account is legally held by Monica and a man named Lance. The courtroom erupted into shocked murmurs. I heard Aunt Margaret gasp loudly behind me. The sound of her sudden realization was incredibly tragic, but entirely necessary. Would you like to formally tell the judge who Lance is, Monica? Or should I asked, my tone dripping with icy contempt. Monica said absolutely nothing. Her mouth opened and closed silently. She looked exactly like a fish that had been violently pulled out of the water and thrown onto the deck. Lance is a commercial real estate agent based in Galveston, I informed the court, turning back to the judge. He and my stepmother have been engaged in an ongoing romantic relationship for approximately 3 years. It began long before my father ever had his stroke. In the yellow tabs, Your Honor, you will find high-resolution, time-stamped photographs of the 2 of them embracing on the balcony of a multi-million-dollar beachfront condo in Galveston. A condo, I might add, that was leased just 2 months after my father's severe stroke, completely financed through interstate wire transfers using money stolen directly from the family trust. The gallery was now completely, terrifyingly silent. It was not the uncomfortable, judgmental silence from the beginning of the hearing. This was the heavy, shocking silence of people who were rapidly recalculating absolutely everything they thought they knew about their own family. Preston was practically vibrating with panic. He grabbed Monica's arm and aggressively whispered into her ear, telling her to invoke her right to remain silent. But Monica was completely spiraling out of control. Her massive ego could not handle the public humiliation. It is not what it looks like, she suddenly blurted out, frantically waving her hands. I was just managing the funds. Donovan told me to do it. He gave me full legal authority before he died. He wanted me to have that money. I smiled. This was exactly the moment I had been waiting for. She had just walked directly, willingly into the final, inescapable trap. He did not, I said softly, my voice slicing through her lies. And I can scientifically prove it. Your Honor, if you would please turn to the final section in the yellow tabs. This is the part that officially turns this civil conservatorship hearing into a massive criminal investigation. I watched Preston's face drain of any remaining color. He slowly backed away from Monica, putting physical distance between himself and his client. He knew exactly what document I was about to bring up, and he knew that his own career was about to violently end. My stepmother proudly submitted a formal legal document to this court as part of her petition. I stated, pointing at the stack of papers on the defense table. It is located on page 14 of her original filing. It is a typed letter, supposedly written and signed by my father just 3 months before his death, granting Monica broad, unchecked financial authority over the family trust. Judge Caldwell flipped to the document in his own file, examining it closely. I had that specific letter analyzed by a certified, independent forensic document examiner, I continued, my voice echoing with absolute authority. The examiner's comprehensive report is located behind the final yellow tab in your binder, Your Honor. The signature on that letter is a complete digital fake. It was intentionally lifted from a different, legitimate document, specifically a joint property tax filing from 2023, and crudely pasted onto the fake letter using consumer image editing software. Monica let out a high-pitched, panicked noise, almost like a whimper. Furthermore, I said, delivering the absolute final, lethal blow, the hidden metadata embedded in the PDF file of that letter clearly shows that the document was digitally created exactly 4 days after my father's death. And the IP address identifying where the file was originally created? It is actively registered to the private office network of Mr. Preston's law firm. Preston completely lost it. He slammed both of his hands loudly onto the table, sending pens flying. This is outrageous. This is a complete fabrication. I never saw that document before my client brought it to me. The letter is a complete forgery, I stated firmly, looking directly up at Judge Caldwell, ignoring the screaming lawyer. It was submitted under oath to this court as part of a highly fraudulent conservatorship petition designed to strip me of my rights. That isn't just a simple civil disagreement over stolen money, Your Honor. Under the Texas Penal Code, that is aggravated perjury. And, because it was used in an attempt to secure over $300,000 through deception, it is a first-degree felony. Judge Caldwell stared at Preston for a very, very long time. The silence was incredibly heavy. Mr. Preston, the judge said quietly, his voice dangerously soft. Did you personally prepare that fraudulent document in your office? Preston was heavily sweating right through his expensive gray shirt. You could clearly see the dark, wet patches rapidly spreading under his arms. He did not answer the question. He didn't need to. The digital metadata had his fingerprints completely all over it. The alliance shattered in real time. 2 greedy thieves trapped in a rapidly sinking boat, violently trying to throw each other overboard to save themselves. He told me it would hold up. Monica suddenly hissed, pointing an accusing finger directly at her own lawyer, completely throwing him under the bus. He told me judges never check these things. This was his idea. Preston flinched violently like he had just been physically slapped across the face. I didn't want this to happen. Monica cried, suddenly turning around to face the crowded gallery, desperately trying to appeal to Aunt Margaret. Her voice cracked dramatically. She was trying so hard to squeeze out tears, but it wasn't working. The mask had slipped entirely off, revealing the ugly, greedy truth underneath. Donovan was going to leave me with absolutely nothing. After everything I sacrificed for him. 18 years I gave that man. You didn't give him anything, I said coldly, cutting her off. You just kept his money. That's all you ever cared about. Judge Caldwell raised his hand, instantly shutting down the chaos. He took a long, deep breath and spoke in the heavy, final tone of a man handing down a devastating verdict. This court finds absolutely no credible evidence of mental incapacity on the part of the respondent, Ms. Valerie, he declared loudly. The petition for emergency conservatorship is immediately denied with prejudice. Furthermore, I am officially referring this entire matter, including the forged documents and the fraudulent petition, directly to the Harris County District Attorney's Office for immediate criminal investigation. He looked directly at Monica, who was now visibly shaking. Ma'am, I strongly suggest you retain entirely separate criminal defense counsel immediately. Mr. Preston will certainly not be able to represent you, as he is now a primary subject of the exact same criminal investigation. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom slowly opened, and the gallery began to empty out in a state of absolute shock. I stayed behind at the defense table, slowly packing my laptop into my bag. My hands were finally steady. My heart rate had returned to completely normal. I felt exactly the way you feel when you finally cross the finish line of an exhausting, brutal marathon, completely depleted, but incredibly clear-headed. I had stopped running. Aunt Margaret waited for me outside in the wide, marble hallway. When I walked through the doors, she completely broke down. She was crying hysterically, pulling me into a tight, desperate hug. "Valerie, sweetheart, I am so incredibly sorry," she sobbed into my shoulder. "I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know. She told us all those horrible things. She convinced me you were losing your mind." "I know exactly what she said, Aunt Margaret," I replied softly, rubbing her back. I wasn't angry at her anymore. I deeply understood the mechanics of the abuse. Narcissists do not just casually manipulate their primary victims, they actively manipulate all the witnesses, too. They build a false, alternate reality so incredibly convincing that even good, honest people get trapped inside the illusion. "Why didn't you just tell me the truth?" she asked, pulling back and looking at me with tear-filled eyes. "Because I desperately needed you to believe her," I explained calmly. "If you had openly doubted her story, she would have panicked and changed her entire plan." She needed a full, captive audience. She needed everyone in that courtroom nodding along. That was the absolute only way she would feel arrogant and confident enough to push forward with the petition. And filing that petition was the only way to get her forged letter permanently on the court record under oath, where it legally becomes a severe felony. Margaret just stared at me, completely awestruck by the level of calculated patience it took to pull it off. The criminal justice system moved surprisingly fast after the judge's aggressive referral. Exactly 3 weeks later, Monica was formally indicted by a grand jury on 6 severe counts, including theft from an estate, aggravated perjury, and money laundering. Preston was indicted separately and immediately lost his law license. Lance, the coward, instantly flipped on Monica to save himself, fully cooperating with the federal prosecutors in exchange for a lighter sentence of house arrest. The Galveston beachfront condo was immediately seized by the government. The massive Charles Schwab brokerage account was entirely frozen, and every single stolen dollar in those Wyoming shell companies was legally clawed back into the family trust. Monica eventually took a cowardly plea deal just to avoid a highly publicized trial. She was sentenced to 6 hard years in state custody. I sold the big house in River Oaks and the lake house in Conroe. I used a massive portion of those funds to formally establish a permanent, fully funded scholarship in my biological mother's name at her old university. I moved out of that terrible, depressing studio apartment and bought a beautiful, quiet home with a massive backyard. I even adopted a goofy, 3-legged rescue dog and named him Verdict, mostly because my therapist suggested that finding humor in the trauma was a healthy coping mechanism. On a quiet, sunny afternoon exactly 1 year after the trial, I drove back to the cemetery. I walked under the shade of the massive live oak tree and sat on the soft grass between my mother and father's graves. I sat there for hours, just watching the leaves blow in the warm wind. I felt a profound, deep sense of peace that I had not felt since I was 11 years old. I had finally severed the leash. I had protected my father's hard work, and I had destroyed the monster that lived in our house. I looked at my dad's headstone and smiled. People often mistakenly think that true strength is simply the magical absence of fear. It is not. Strength is knowing with absolute certainty that the person sitting completely across the dinner table is lying straight to your face and choosing to sit there quietly, eat your food, and wait. Because you know that infinite patience is the one weapon the greedy never, ever see coming. So, Reddit, looking back at those 11 agonizing months of keeping my own family completely in the dark just to quietly build an airtight, inescapable federal case, was I wrong for letting my own aunt believe I had completely lost my mind? Or did I do exactly what was absolutely necessary to protect my father's legacy from a monster? Drop your verdict in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat and you haven't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on the wildest family dramas. See you in the next video.